Daniel was only 16 years old, but life had already taught him lessons most grown men avoided. His father had passed away when he was a child, leaving behind only memories and a small rented house that always needed repair. His mother, a gentle woman with tired eyes, worked long hours at a small diner just to keep food on the table. They had no savings, no fancy clothes, and no security for tomorrow, but they had each other. Daniel was not like the other students at the private school he attended. While most of his classmates came in expensive cars driven by chauffeurs, he came walking, his shoes worn thin. While others had neatly pressed uniforms, his shirt often had faint wrinkles, and sometimes the shoes he wore had been stitched back together by his mother's careful hands. Still, he carried himself with quiet dignity. He knew he didn't have wealth, but he had something far greater: determination. He had received a scholarship because of his excellent grades. Teachers recognized his talent in mathematics and writing, and even though the scholarship covered tuition, there were many hidden costs: books, uniforms, lab fees, things Daniel often struggled to pay. To help, he worked part-time at his mother's diner, cleaning tables and washing dishes after school. Some nights he stayed awake past midnight finishing his homework, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. The next morning he often arrived late, not because he was careless, but because he had been helping his mother clean up after closing the diner. Sadly, the principal of the school never cared to understand Daniel's situation. To the principal, rules were more important than compassion. He believed that the school's reputation depended on order, discipline, and money. Students who couldn't keep up financially didn't belong there, in his eyes. One cloudy morning, Daniel entered the classroom quietly, trying to ignore the stares of some of the wealthier students who often mocked his old shoes or the simple lunch he brought in a brown paper bag. He focused on the lesson, eager to lose himself in numbers and words where wealth didn't matter. But at midday during lunch break, a student office messenger came to the classroom and announced that the principal wanted to see Daniel immediately. His heart sank. Walking through the long corridor, Daniel tried to think of what he might have done wrong. His hands trembled slightly as he knocked on the office door. The principal, a tall man with gray hair and a stern expression, looked up from behind his polished desk. He tapped his pen against a file and gestured for Daniel to come in. "Daniel," the principal began, his tone sharp, "we have been patient with you. Too patient, I might say. Your school fees are overdue again. The rules are very clear. If you cannot pay on time, you cannot continue here." Daniel's face flushed with embarrassment. "Sir, my mother is trying her best. She promised she will pay in a few days. Please, I just need a little more time." But the principal shook his head. "This is not a charity. This is a private institution. We cannot run a school on promises. You either pay or you leave. I have already given you chances." Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. His hands clenched at his sides. He wanted to explain how hard his mother worked, how he was earning money at the diner, how his scholarship should have meant more than just tuition, but the words stuck. The principal wasn't listening. The door suddenly opened and a few teachers stepped in with files. They froze when they saw Daniel standing there. The principal didn't lower his voice. Instead, he spoke louder as if to make an example. "Pack your things, Daniel. You are expelled, effective immediately." The words cut deeper than any knife. Expelled, thrown out like he was nothing. His knees felt weak. He looked at the teachers, hoping someone would defend him, but no one spoke. They simply looked away. When Daniel left the office, his classmates were already whispering. Some had heard the principal's words through the open door. The hallway felt longer than ever as he walked, his backpack hanging heavily from his shoulders. A few students stared at him with pity, while others smirked, glad to see the poor boy finally removed from their perfect world. Inside, Daniel's chest burned. He wanted to scream, but he couldn't. He wanted to run, but his legs only carried him slowly. With every step, he felt the weight of shame pressing down. He didn't look back. At the school gate, he paused for a moment. He had always dreamed of walking out of these gates one day with his head held high, holding a diploma that would make his mother proud. But now he was leaving in disgrace. He glanced at the tall buildings of the school one last time, then lowered his head and walked away. The long road home felt endless. Cars rushed past him. Students laughed in the distance, and the world seemed so unfair. When he finally reached the small diner where his mother was working, he tried to hide his face, but she immediately knew something was wrong. "Daniel, what happened?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. His voice cracked as he spoke. They expelled me, Mom. Her eyes widened in shock, then softened with sadness. She pulled him into her arms, holding him tightly as tears welled in his eyes. It's okay, my son. We will find another way. You are not a failure. You are my pride. But Daniel felt broken. He had worked so hard, and it still wasn't enough. That night, after the diner closed, he sat by the window of their small house, staring at the streetlights outside. His notebooks lay open, but he couldn't focus. His dreams seemed to be slipping away, and he didn't know how to hold on to them. What he didn't realize was that his story had just begun. Life had placed him at the bottom, but destiny was quietly preparing something far greater. Somewhere beyond the dark night, change was already on its way, and it would arrive in a way Daniel never could have imagined. Daniel woke up the next morning with a heavy heart. The memory of being expelled from school the day before still burned in his mind like a fresh wound. He lay in bed staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to the faint sound of his mother preparing breakfast in the kitchen. Normally, he would have been getting ready for school, polishing his shoes quickly and rushing to class with his books in his hand. But today there was no reason to hurry. Today, he was just a boy with no school to attend, and the weight of that thought pressed down on him harder than anything he had ever carried. His mother knocked gently on his door. "Daniel, come eat something," she called softly. He didn't want to move, but he couldn't ignore the warmth in her voice. She had been his only strength all these years. Slowly he stood up, washed his face, and went to the kitchen. She had prepared 2 pieces of toast and some scrambled eggs, though she had clearly eaten nothing herself. She smiled at him, but behind her tired eyes he could see the worry. "Mom, I'm sorry," he whispered as he sat down. She shook her head quickly. "No, Daniel, don't you ever say sorry. You did nothing wrong. That principal, he doesn't see your heart, your effort, or your talent. But I see it, and one day the world will see it too." Her words were comforting, but Daniel still felt a storm inside. After breakfast, instead of putting on his school uniform, he put on his work clothes, a simple t-shirt and jeans, and decided to go to the diner with her. If he couldn't study, at least he could help her earn money. The diner was small and old, with peeling paint on the walls, but it was filled with familiar faces from the neighborhood. Daniel usually worked evenings, but now he followed his mother in the morning. The regular customers smiled when they saw him. "No school today, Daniel?" an old man at the corner table asked. Daniel forced a small smile and just said, "Not today." He didn't have the courage to explain the truth. As the hours passed, Daniel worked silently. He cleared tables, washed dishes, and served coffee. But inside, his mind kept drifting back to the humiliation of standing in front of the principal's desk, hearing the word expelled echo in his ears. He wanted so badly to prove that he was worth more than what people thought of him. That evening, when the rush of customers had slowed down, an older man entered the diner. He had a gentle face, white hair neatly combed, and he wore a simple brown coat. Unlike other wealthy-looking men who came in fancy cars, this man carried himself with quiet dignity. He greeted Daniel's mother politely and sat down at one of the corner tables. Daniel brought him a glass of water and asked, "Sir, would you like to see the menu?" The man smiled kindly. "Yes, please. But first tell me your name, young man." "I'm Daniel," he replied softly, handing him the menu. "Daniel," the man repeated thoughtfully. "That's a strong name. You look like a boy with a lot on his mind." Daniel froze for a moment. He didn't usually talk to strangers, especially about his feelings. But there was something comforting about this man's voice. "It's been a hard week," Daniel admitted. The man nodded gently. "Do you want to tell me about it?" Daniel hesitated, then sat down for a brief moment, lowering his voice so no one else would hear. "I was expelled from school yesterday. The principal said I couldn't stay because my fees were late. My mother is working day and night, but it wasn't enough. I tried, but it didn't matter. I feel like everything I worked for is gone now." The man's eyes softened. He listened carefully, not interrupting, not judging. When Daniel finished speaking, the man said quietly, "That must have been very painful. But let me tell you something, Daniel. The world doesn't always measure people fairly. Sometimes those who shine the brightest are hidden in the shadows. But if you keep your heart pure and your mind focused, opportunities will find you." Daniel looked at him curiously. "Do you really think so?" "I know so," the man replied firmly, his eyes twinkling with a strange certainty. Daniel didn't know who this man was, but his words felt like a bandage over a deep wound. He thanked him quietly and went back to work. The man ordered a simple meal, soup and bread, and ate slowly, occasionally glancing at Daniel with a thoughtful smile. Before leaving, he paid the bill generously and left a tip larger than Daniel had ever seen. That night, as Daniel and his mother closed the diner, he told her about the conversation. She smiled softly. "See, Daniel? Not everyone sees us as less. There are good people in this world. Hold on to hope." But Daniel still worried. "Mom, what if I can't study again? What if this is the end of everything?" She took his hands in hers. "It's never the end, my son. You are only at the beginning. You may not see the road ahead, but I promise life will surprise you." The next morning, while the world was going about its business, Daniel stayed at home. He opened his books, trying to study on his own. But his thoughts were distracted. Meanwhile, at the school he had been expelled from, students whispered in hallways about what had happened. Some missed his quiet determination in class. Others laughed behind his back, glad the poor kid was gone. And the principal walked proudly through the corridors, convinced he had made the right decision. He didn't know, nor did anyone at the school, that something extraordinary was about to happen. Life was quietly setting the stage for a scene that none of them would ever forget. A storm of change was forming, and it was headed straight for that schoolyard. Daniel sat by the window that evening, watching the sky turn red as the sun sank behind the buildings. He didn't know what the future held, but he could still hear the stranger's voice in his mind. "If you keep your heart pure and your mind focused, opportunities will find you," he sighed deeply, not knowing that the words would come true sooner than he ever imagined, for destiny had already sent that stranger into his path, and the next day would bring a moment so powerful that it would silence every laugh, every whisper, and every cruel word ever spoken against him. The sun rose over the schoolyard the next morning, but there was something unusual in the air. The day began like any other. Students in clean uniforms arrived in cars, some laughing with friends, some rushing with their bags. Teachers carried files and prepared for classes. The principal, proud as ever, walked through the corridor with his hands behind his back. He greeted parents and reminded staff of rules, wearing his usual stern expression. For him, it was just another day of order and discipline, but among the students, whispers of Daniel's expulsion were still fresh. Some of them shook their heads, saying it was unfair. A few who had always mocked him laughed quietly, saying he didn't belong here anyway. Yet others missed his presence. One girl in his class whispered to her friend, "He always helped me with math homework. He didn't deserve this." The friend nodded, but both knew their opinions wouldn't change the principal's mind. By mid-morning, the classes were in full swing. The sound of chalk tapping on boards filled the rooms, and pages of books turned softly. Suddenly, a low rumble began to spread across the sky. At first, students thought it was thunder. They looked out the windows and shaded their eyes, but the skies were clear. The sound grew louder, like giant wings beating the air. Within moments, the deep roar of a helicopter filled the campus. The spinning blades cut through the calm, sending gusts of wind across the trees. Students jumped to their feet, pressing against the windows to see. Teachers tried to quiet them down, but curiosity was stronger than discipline. "A helicopter?" One boy gasped. "Here!" At our school. The sound grew deafening as a sleek black helicopter descended over the field behind the main building. Dust rose in swirling clouds, the grass flattened, and students screamed in excitement. Some covered their ears, others waved from the windows as if greeting a celebrity. Teachers rushed outside to see what was happening, their faces pale with confusion. The principal marched toward the field angrily. His voice was sharp over the noise. "What is the meaning of this? Who gave permission for this chaos?" But his words were lost in the roar of the blades. He shielded his eyes as the helicopter slowly landed. The door slid open, and for a brief moment, silence swept the crowd. Out stepped the same old man who had visited Daniel at the diner the previous night. But today he was not dressed in a simple coat. Today he wore a perfectly tailored suit, and behind him stepped two assistants carrying files. Everyone gasped. He was not just an ordinary customer. He was someone powerful, someone important. The students whispered loudly. "Who is he? Why would a man like that come here? Is he famous?" The teachers exchanged nervous glances, suddenly realizing this was no ordinary visit. The billionaire had arrived. The man walked calmly across the field as if the spinning helicopter behind him was nothing unusual. His gaze was steady, his presence commanding. Even without words, he carried an authority that silenced the crowd. He walked directly toward the principal, who was now sweating under his collar. Sir, welcome," the principal stammered, forcing a smile. "We didn't expect such an important guest." The man nodded politely but wasted no time. "I'm here to talk about one of your students. Or rather, a student you expelled." The principal froze, his heart skipping a beat. He knew immediately who the man was talking about. "Daniel." "Yes, well," the principal began, struggling to maintain control. "You see, that boy was not following the rules. Fees were unpaid. We have standards here. Discipline must be maintained." The man raised his hand, cutting him off with quiet authority. "I met Daniel last night. I spoke to him. I learned his story. And I learned yours." His voice was calm, but his words carried weight that pressed down on everyone listening. By now, the entire school had gathered around the field. Students, teachers, and even the janitors stood in a wide circle, watching this extraordinary scene unfold. Some held their breath, others whispered in disbelief. The billionaire continued, "That boy is bright, polite, hard-working. He studies after long hours of helping his mother at a diner. He faces struggles most of these children will never know, and yet he still excels. Do you call that failure? Do you call that unworthy?" The principal's face flushed red. He tried to smile again, but his lips trembled. "Sir, I only follow policy. Rules must be equal for all. Exceptions cannot be made." The billionaire's eyes narrowed. "Equal? Do you call it equal when the rich are forgiven for their late payments but the poor are humiliated? Do you call it equal when you value money over talent?" The crowd stirred, students whispering louder now. Some of the wealthier children looked uncomfortable while others nodded in agreement. The billionaire stepped closer to the principal. "I am a man who has built businesses, schools, and hospitals. I have traveled the world. And let me tell you this. The greatest leaders, the greatest minds often come from humble beginnings. If you expel boys like Daniel, you are not protecting your school's reputation. You are destroying its very soul." The words struck like thunder. Even the teachers lowered their heads, ashamed of their silence the day before. The billionaire turned to face the crowd. His voice rose with strength. "From this day forward, Daniel will not only return to this school, but his education will be fully funded by me. Every book, every fee, every need. More than that, I will provide scholarships for other hard-working children who face the same struggles, because talent and determination deserve a place to grow no matter how poor the pockets may be." The students erupted into cheers. They clapped and shouted Daniel's name, their voices echoing across the campus. Some of his classmates who had once mocked him now looked at each other with regret. Others whispered in awe, never expecting such a dramatic turn. The billionaire paused, then faced the principal again. "And as for you, sir, I will donate a large amount to this institution, but only under one condition. From this day you will treat every child with dignity, whether rich or poor. If I hear of another student being humiliated for his financial struggles, this donation will be withdrawn, and I will personally see that this school's name is dragged into the newspapers for its cruelty. Do you understand?" The principal nodded quickly, his face pale. Yes, of course, sir. It will never happen again." The billionaire gave a final nod and turned toward the helicopter. His assistants followed. But before stepping inside, he looked at the students and raised his hand in a gesture of encouragement. "Remember, children, greatness does not come from wealth. It comes from character. Never forget that." As the blades began to spin again, lifting the helicopter into the sky, the students cheered louder than ever. The sound of their voices mixed with the roar of the engine until it faded into the distance. But the message remained, planted deep in every heart that had witnessed the scene. Back at home, Daniel was still helping his mother when the news began to spread. Students were already texting him, calling his name with excitement, telling him everything that had happened. His heart pounded as he listened. For the first time in days, a smile spread across his face. Something extraordinary was happening, and it was only the beginning. When the helicopter lifted back into the sky, the noise slowly faded, but the echoes of the billionaire's words still hung heavy in the schoolyard. Students stood frozen, some clapping half-heartedly, some whispering in amazement. Teachers looked at each other with guilt and unease, and the principal, who only minutes earlier had strutted through the corridors with confidence, now stood sweating, humiliated, and exposed. His proud face was pale and his hands shook slightly as he adjusted his tie. The billionaire's promise had shaken everyone. Daniel, the boy they had seen as an outcast, was suddenly at the center of something much bigger. Though Daniel wasn't there to witness the scene, his name was being carried across the campus like fire in dry grass. Students repeated the words they had just heard. Some imitated the billionaire's deep voice, saying, "Greatness does not come from wealth, it comes from character." Others whispered, "Can you believe he came for Daniel? Of all people, Daniel." The principal tried to regain control, ordering students back to their classrooms, but the excitement was too much. Even when classes resumed, the buzz of the helicopter still filled the air. Students scribbled Daniel's name in their notebooks. They argued in hushed tones about whether he would really come back. Later that day, the staff gathered in the conference room. The principal sat at the head of the table, his face stiff, trying to act composed. But every teacher there had seen his arrogance crumble under the billionaire's words. A younger teacher who had always admired Daniel's intelligence finally spoke. "Sir, I think we should welcome Daniel back. He deserves it. He was one of our best students." The principal cleared his throat, avoiding her gaze. Yes. Of course, we will welcome him back. The school must show its generosity. But remember, this was not my decision. It was the donor's request." Everyone in the room knew the truth. The principal was not acting out of generosity, but fear. Still, no one argued. They only nodded because they too had been shaken by the billionaire's words. Meanwhile, at the diner, Daniel still didn't know the full details of what had happened. He had only heard fragments from classmates who called him, their voices filled with excitement. He sat with his mother in the quiet corner after closing, the day's events swirling in his mind. "Mom," he whispered, "why would a man like that care about me? Why would he come to the school in a helicopter?" His mother smiled faintly, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "Because, my son, good people see what others ignore. You have always worked hard, and perhaps God sent someone to notice that. Sometimes blessings come when we least expect them." Daniel wanted to believe her words, but a part of him was afraid. What if it was all just talk? What if the principal still hated him and refused to let him return? The next morning, the school's gates opened as usual, but the atmosphere was different. Students carried fresh stories of the billionaire's visit. Parents arriving with their children had already heard the news through phone calls and social media. The school was the talk of the town. By mid-morning, the principal received an official letter delivered by one of the billionaire's assistants. It was a formal document confirming the billionaire's pledge. Not only would Daniel's education be fully funded, but a new scholarship program was being established in the school for poor but hardworking students. The donation was so large that it could improve the school's facilities for years. But the letter also carried a strict condition. If any student is mistreated because of poverty, the letter read, the funds will be immediately withdrawn, and the school's actions will be made public. The principal's hands shook as he read the words aloud to his staff. His pride was crushed, and though he hated the feeling of being controlled, he dared not challenge the billionaire's authority. He called an emergency meeting with the teachers. "We will arrange a special assembly," the principal announced, his voice heavy. "We will invite Daniel back in front of everyone. The donor wants him treated with respect, so respect he shall get." But inside, the principal's heart was boiling. He had always believed money gave him power, and now someone with more money had taken that power away. The next day, Daniel and his mother were invited to the school. When they stepped onto the campus, students gathered quickly, their voices rising in excitement. Some cheered, some clapped, and others simply stared, unable to believe the boy they had seen expelled days earlier was now returning like a hero. Daniel walked nervously beside his mother, clutching his bag. His eyes moved from one face to another, unsure if the smiles were real or mocking. But when he saw the younger teacher smiling warmly at him and nodding in encouragement, he felt a little braver. The assembly hall was full. Students sat in rows, teachers lined the sides, and the principal stood on stage, holding a microphone. He cleared his throat and forced a smile that looked unnatural. "Today," he began, "we welcome back one of our students, Daniel. After reconsideration and with generous support from a respected donor, Daniel will continue his studies here. We regret any misunderstanding in the past. It was not a real apology, but it was the closest the proud man could bring himself to say. His words were met with loud applause from the students. Many of them shouted Daniel's name, clapping and cheering. Daniel stood quietly, overwhelmed. His mother placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes shining with tears. For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt seen, not as a poor boy who didn't belong, but as someone who mattered. After the assembly, students crowded around him. Some who had once ignored him now wanted to shake his hand. A few even said sorry for laughing at him before. Daniel was shy, but he answered politely, never letting pride rise in his heart. Deep down, he remembered the billionaire's advice about character being greater than wealth. That evening, as he walked home with his mother, the sky glowed orange with sunset. Daniel carried his books close to his chest, his heart full of hope. He didn't know what the future would hold, but he felt stronger than before. His return was not just about him. It was about every child who had ever been judged unfairly. And in a quiet office far away, the billionaire sat at his desk, smiling as he read the report of the assembly. He knew he had planted a seed, not just in Daniel's life, but in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed the moment. For Daniel, this was the turning point. The humiliation of the past was fading, replaced by the glow of dignity and respect. What had once felt like the end of his dreams was now the beginning of something far great. The days that followed Daniel's return to school felt like a dream. He walked through the gates with his books in hand, and for the first time the other students didn't look at him with pity or mockery. Instead, many of them smiled, some waved, and some even whispered his name with respect. The boy who once felt invisible now stood taller, not because of pride, but because he carried within him a quiet strength that everyone could feel. His classmates noticed the difference too. Before, he used to sit at the back of the classroom, trying not to draw attention to his old shoes or second-hand bag. Now he sat in the same place, but there was something new in his eyes, a light that came from dignity, not wealth. Even the ones who had teased him before hesitated when they saw him. A few gathered courage to say, "Sorry, Daniel. We shouldn't have treated you that way." Daniel didn't hold grudges. He simply nodded and replied softly, "It's okay." Those two words carried more power than anger ever could. The teachers also treated him differently. The younger teacher, who had always supported him, now openly praised his work in front of the class. Others, who had remained silent when he was expelled, now made efforts to encourage him. They gave him extra notes, asked for his opinions in class discussions, and showed him the respect he had always deserved. The principal, though, was a different story. His pride still hurt from the billionaire's visit, and every time he saw Daniel, he was reminded of the humiliation he had suffered in front of the entire school. Yet he dared not show his dislike openly. Instead, he forced a smile whenever he passed Daniel, though deep inside he hoped the boy would fade quietly into the background. But Daniel did not fade. He grew brighter with each passing day. At home, life was also changing. Daniel's mother noticed the difference in her son's posture, in the way he spoke, and in the way he studied late into the night. There was no longer the same shadow of hopelessness in his eyes. The burden had not disappeared, and they were still poor. And she still worked long hours at the diner, but there was now hope. And hope made even the hardest days easier. One evening, as they sat together at the small kitchen table, Daniel looked at her and said, "Mom, I want to make something of my life. Not just for me, but for you. You've given everything to me, and I promise I'll give it back one day." Tears filled her eyes as she held his hands. "You already give me everything I need, Daniel. Your kindness, your effort, your heart, that is more than enough." But Daniel was determined. He began studying harder than ever before. He read not only his school textbooks, but also borrowed books from the library about science, business, and history. He wrote essays late into the night, scribbling ideas and dreams into old notebooks. His classmates noticed his dedication and started turning to him for help. Slowly, the boy who once walked alone became someone others looked up to. The billionaire, too, kept his word. He visited the school quietly a few weeks later, without the helicopter, without noise. He sat in the back of a classroom, watching Daniel solve a difficult math problem on the board. The way Daniel explained his answer, clearly, patiently, with confidence, made the man smile. After class, he called Daniel aside. "You remind me of myself when I was young," the billionaire said softly. "I too came from nothing. I too was told I didn't belong. But I never stopped working, and I never let pride turn me bitter. I see the same fire in you. Promise me you will keep it alive." Daniel nodded, his heart racing. "I promise, sir." News of Daniel's journey began to spread beyond the school. Parents spoke of him to their children, telling them how a poor boy's hard work had brought a billionaire to their gates. Local newspapers wrote short articles about the scholarship program, praising the school for its new support of underprivileged students. Though the articles mentioned the billionaire's donation, many focused on Daniel's story, calling it an inspiration for the youth. Students from nearby schools even began to whisper his name, curious about the boy who had once been expelled and then brought back with honor. For Daniel, this attention felt strange. He had never wanted fame. All he had wanted was the chance to learn, to grow, and to make his mother proud. But perhaps the greatest change was within the school itself. Before, students from poor backgrounds had lived in quiet fear, hiding their struggles. Now they walked a little taller, knowing they had someone standing up for them. Some even approached Daniel privately to thank him. "Because of you, I don't feel so ashamed anymore," one boy whispered one afternoon. Daniel smiled and replied, "Never be ashamed of where you come from. Be proud of where you're going." The principal, though still bitter, had no choice but to accept this new reality. Under the watchful eye of the billionaire, he treated all students with more care. He learned to bite back his harsh words, at least in public. His authority no longer came from fear, but from the pressure of accountability. As months passed, Daniel's story became a lesson told again and again. Teachers used it to encourage struggling students. Parents used it to remind their children about kindness and humility. Even the wealthier classmates who once judged him began to see that money wasn't everything. One morning, while walking through the schoolyard, Daniel overheard two younger boys talking. "Do you know who he is?" one asked, pointing at him. The other replied proudly, "That's Daniel. He's the boy the billionaire came for. He's the reason poor kids like us have a chance here." Daniel felt his cheeks grow warm, but he didn't say anything. He simply walked forward, holding his books tighter with a heart full of quiet gratitude. At home, his mother often looked at him and thought about how much he had grown. The boy who once came home with heavy shoulders now carried himself like someone who believed in his worth. She often whispered a prayer of thanks for the stranger who had walked into their diner that night and changed their lives forever. But deep inside, Daniel knew the billionaire had only opened a door. It was up to him to walk through it and build the future he dreamed of, and he was ready. He was ready to prove to the world that true greatness is not measured by money, clothes, or cars, but by the strength of the heart and the courage to keep going, even when everything seems lost. The story of the poor boy and the helicopter landing at his school became a symbol, a reminder to students, teachers, and even parents that every child deserves a chance. And though Daniel was still just a boy with dreams, he had already become something much greater. He had become hope.